Well, we're going to start right away. My name is Bethany Lecture. I came from up in Oxford today, and I'm very, very glad to be here. So glad to talk to you about this question. Natural disasters, animal suffering, and God. How do we hold them together? Can we hold them together? Now, I have to start and say that everyone speaks from a perspective, and that's true of myself as well. I'm a practicing Christian, and I speak as a Christian theologian. But if you come from a different faith tradition or you come from no faith tradition, that's fine. We can still talk about these things, and you guys have valuable contributions to bring. I don't stand here as the expert saying, these are the answers. I really want to enter into discussion with you. So let's look at part of the problem. You guys might remember the 2010 Haiti earthquake. It was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake that happened just off the coast, and it resulted in 140,000 deaths. Similarly, the Japanese earthquake in 2011 covered 217 square miles of Japan with its tsunami and killed nearly 16,000 people. Then, 2004, going back, the Indonesian earthquake, which you'll remember on Boxing Day. This is the biggest one of recent history in terms of the human count, 230 to 240,000 deaths with this 9.1 magnitude earthquake. But, there are a great deal of actual deaths and suffering that comes out. The natural disasters can hugely influence human work in other ways as well. And so you'll remember when that unpronounceable Icelandic volcano exploded and none of European air traffic could happen any further. So these are huge events that have massive implications for human well-being, but also non-human well-being. One of the statistics that's never recorded, because it can't be, is how many other animals die in these events. And it hasn't just been a recent problem. One of the most famous events in antiquity was when Mount Vesuvius in 79 Common Era erupted and killed over 1,500 people. And when it did so, it actually covered Herculaneum, this nearby town, in soot and ash and perfectly preserved it. So the only reason they've found a death count is because they've been able to go through the excavations and find the bodies still preserved after they were covered by this hot ash and smoke. So very quickly, why do earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis happen? I'm assuming you guys are generally familiar with the idea of plate tectonics, that the continents sit on these shifting bases, and that when they encounter each other, you have subduction plates, or plates are going underneath other ones, and other places where they're pulling apart, and new land is forming from the mantle rising up into the ocean, particularly the mid-Atlantic ridge. Everybody's familiar with the basic geography? Great, geology rather. So here's the question: why would God allow this? That's what we're going to be looking at. So if you want to look at the handouts that you have in front of you, I've sent them around. We're going to start by looking at a couple of different answers that people have given to this question. So if you want to read the very first one by this chap, John Calvin, read it over and see what you think. You have 30 seconds to read that over. All right, so John Calvin, if he's saying, why does God allow these to happen? What is the answer? Yeah?
Because we've sinned.
Right, sin, the sin explanation. So what happened? Why are these horrible things happening? Well, God never intended them to. God made a perfect world that had no natural disasters, and then you have this event in the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve take this apple, eat it, and suddenly the earth breaks apart, and you have volcanoes erupting out, and you have all these disasters coming in. Now, is it a plausible explanation? I don't know. Why don't you take 2 minutes, talk to your neighbor, and ask, what are the pros and what are the cons of this sort of a position? Why is it a good argument? Why is it a bad argument? Is this a plausible argument? Okay, I'm going to go to that group first.
You don't think it's that great of an argument because there was, like you said, there was many that died, many hundreds of thousands that died, and yet surely not all of them would have sinned, and so it seems unfair in that those who didn't sin are also getting punished.
Okay, so if you have this sense that such a disaster is caused by sin, it seems really, really unfair that so many people should die for particular sins that they perhaps didn't do the sins that would deserve that kind of a response. Okay? And then, you know, I mean, if I'm playing an advocate, I might, or devil's advocate here, I might say, well, actually, everybody has sinned. So everybody could deserve this, you know. So it could come back and forth. But the fact that it's unfair and indiscriminate is absolutely a great response. How about over here? What were you thinking?
We also said something similar to that. Like it can, some people can see this like a good argument because it can be seen as like a punishment for what I believe in. So everyone has sinned in there, but on the other hand, it's a bit harsh. Like you can't do that.
Right, too harsh. Yeah, little babies died in those events as well, and they can't sin. All the animals that died, yeah. Right. What does this say about God? Sorry, I can't help but use shorthand. That's a theos from Greek for God. Sorry, I can't help it. It always goes shorthand with me. Okay, so those are really good. Let me ask another question. How long have humans been around? Ages? How long have humans been? Sorry? Yeah, okay, so the Earth is 4.5 billion years. Yeah, okay.
Animals came first, and dinosaurs and stuff, and plants and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then what? And humans come.
All right, so humans, anatomically modern humans that look like us, have been around for about 200,000 years.
That's not very long.
Behaviorally modern humans, 50,000. So if we were going to say that, you know, people's behavior starts to look like something that could even mildly be considered sin, we're looking at 50,000 years. How long have there been natural disasters?
Since
Now I'm looking for the number over here. Yeah, like, you know, 4 billion years since the Earth began. So you have a huge chronological problem here. It's hard, yeah?
Lots of people say that the idea of natural disasters is God trying to remake the world. So, not like this is just,
Yeah.
the idea that with when the dinosaurs came, he was just trying to remake it. That's what some people say.
Yeah, there are people who would talk about, so they might point to the Noahic flood, the story of Noah in the Bible, where God decides to wipe everything out and start anew. And those are all interesting, but those are all after the point that humans are. But natural disasters and the suffering caused by them for the non-human realm has been a lot longer. So let's move on. Let's look to another solution. So if we have the sin solution, we're saying, well, there are big chronological problems. Let's go to Michael Lloyd and C.S. Lewis. Now, we have to be careful about what we say about C.S. Lewis because I live in his house. So, you know, we have to be careful about the critiques that we give him. I live in his house. Yeah. But he's dead. He died in 1963. But I you know, so we just want to, you know. Okay, look at the quotations under the second block. And you're gonna come up with two things. What is he saying is the problem, and what does Michael Lloyd say? And then start thinking about, are these good explanations or not? Which one? Oh, unilaterally on God's own.
Oh,
Okay, so that was number one.
Are we looking at all the rest of it?
No, just look at two right now. So what does number two say? What do Lloyd and Lewis give as an explanation? Yeah. Do you have a what? Yeah.
Does Lewis say that illness and evil has been here before any man?
Yeah. Yeah. And he's sort of, it's a bit of a hard quotation because he doesn't say precisely what he's thinking, and that's why I added Lloyd in as well. What are they both pointing to as the? Yeah. Yeah, an angelic fall. Sort of. So if we have the sin explanation, they give us the Satan explanation. So the reason is that we have all these natural disasters. God, again, never intended them, but there are other spiritual agents at work in the world who are corrupting the whole process. Solves our chronological problem, doesn't it? Right? Plausible. Spiritual elements could have been all the way from the very beginning of the universe. But what are some of the problems with it? Okay, take a moment, talk to your neighbor. You have 30 seconds to discuss the problems of the satanic explanation. Okay, what do we think? Let's pull it back together. I'm going to start with this front table first. Where did your discussion lead?
Well, God is like known for like knowing everything. He's all knowing.
Okay.
No, not being.
Omniscient?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
So he's known for like that. So if he like didn't mean for all of this to happen and like it was Satan's fault, clearly he put the tree there for a reason and stuff.
Okay.
Like, for it to happen, because he knows what's going to happen anyway. So he kind of did mean for it to happen.
Right, there are real questions about God's power.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you guys thought of?
No, we just said like kind of the same thing. Like if God is supposed to be omnipotent, why doesn't he just why don't he just stop the devil from doing it?
Yeah. And the other question would be, so typically when theologians discuss this, they're not just saying natural disasters, but all predation, all creaturely suffering in any sort. So the violence we see when predators, when creatures eat each other. You know, the lion looking at that gazelle, taking it down and eating it, you know, while it's still struggling, right? That's a really vicious thing. And yet, one of the things that Darwin brings out is that that's actually the path by which creatures develop new skills and are created into the diverse forms we see today. So if you don't have the sort of things that Lloyd and Lewis don't like, then you might be in trouble because you're giving Satan the creative power. Does that make sense? Okay, now we're going to similarly, if Satan were the cause of natural disasters, it would lead to a very different problem, which is that natural disasters are actually really, really beneficial. So the interior of the Earth is radioactive. It produces a whole lot of heat. And that whole process of subduction and pulling apart and the hot magma coming up and cooling in the oceans uses a huge amount of the heat that the inner core of the Earth produces. It uses about 90% of that. Now, on planets where you don't have plate tectonics using up this heat, you have something like what you find on Venus, where the heat and the pressure build up until the whole surface of the Earth goes molten. Scientists, in their rather underwhelming way, call this a resurfacing event rather than the magma planet of death, which is probably what a theologian would call it. But anyways, if you have that sort of surface temperature, you simply can't have life. Another thing, the currents in the center of the Earth that help drive, or are thought to help drive, the plate tectonics also create the magnetic field that protects our planet from really dangerous solar rays. So if we didn't have that sort of cosmic protection, again, you wouldn't have the development of complex life in the ways that we see it. So there's all sorts of benefits of plate tectonics. It recycles carbon dioxide, it allows for liquid surface water, it's the reasons we have continents and oceans rather than simply sort of shallow seas. It does all these things. And if we didn't have them, we wouldn't have life. So if there was a clever Satan, he'd probably stop plate tectonics rather than cause them. Does that make sense? Okay, moving on. So we have various different things. I'm going to go through because we're a little bit late and I want to make sure we finish on time. But you can see the difference between Earth's surface and Mars' surface. Another thing that did happen in our global past was what's called the snowball Earth, where the whole planet, it looks like, got covered in ice, a major ice age. And so you had a few living organisms that were able to survive underneath the ice, but global cooling had gone off the edge and covered the Earth in ice and snow. And the only thing that got it out of that situation was that you had these volcanoes releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, which caused a greenhouse effect, which eventually melted this ice. And so it's actually extremely beneficial and extremely important that we have these sorts of natural disasters. So we can see the surface of the Earth instead. Now I'm going to let you loose on the last three explanations. Okay, so we've gone through two. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to go through the next three and give them titles on each of them. You should all have pens from the morning session. So if we have the sin explanation and the Satan explanation for the top two, take a minute and write in a title for each of the bottom three. Go ahead. All right, let's come back together. Okay, so number 3, we've got this guy, Tom Ward. What is he arguing? I'm going to go to, oh, yeah, you want to come in?
Free will.
Free will, yes. Will / sort of free process, because he doesn't say God doesn't control people only, but God doesn't control any events. So God might like to stop the earthquake, but can't. And there's things like that. Okay, number 4. We've got Phil Clayton, Stephen Knapp. I'm going to go to a different table. Just the middle table? Okay, disaster creates change. What do you mean by that?
We said it kind of like goes with the idea that we need disaster to become bad people and dance and things.
Okay, so if I was talking with this group, if I have my 3 brothers, and every time I went to punch them, which occasionally happened in my childhood, I'm not saying it happened a lot, but it happened on occasion, a feather pillow appeared out of nowhere in between me and them, right? So that I could never hurt them and they could never hurt me. What would that mean for my relationship with them?
God exists.
Well, it would very well prove that God exists, yes, if you had these miraculous interventions. But what else would it mean?
It wouldn't be a real relationship.
Yeah, I couldn't have a real relationship with other people if God always intervened to stop harm. Now, sometimes I used to do a lot of rock climbing in the past, right? So I'd be in the Canadian Rockies and be climbing up cliffs and a boulder would fall off, and randomly miss you. But sometimes smaller rocks would fall and you learn to wear a helmet. What would it mean if God intervened every time I slipped?
No one would get hurt. You wouldn't learn from making mistakes.
Yeah, so no one would get hurt, that's true, but I wouldn't learn how to exist in the world either. So then if you're God and you're thinking, well, I'm going to stop that natural disaster, but then where do you draw the line of disaster? At what point do you decide this is serious enough or not serious enough? Right? So what Philip Clayton and Stephen Knapp say is that there is no point where you can say, this is the point. So they have a not even once principle where God will not even once intervene to prevent harm, because then God would be morally obliged to do it in every other case somebody's getting hurt. And you would end up with this world where there's actually no ability to be an autonomous person in relationship with the world or other people. Yeah? All right. How about number 5? John J. Lynch. Table at the back. What does he say? Or what did you write as your title, perhaps?
So you said that, like, if you had a bursting planet, you wouldn't be able to, like, no human could live there. So in order to, like, sustain human life, an earthquake here and there, like, at least you'd still be alive.
Yeah. Yeah, you have, so you could talk about possibly as the lesser evil, or you could talk about it, it's usually talked about as sort of a package deal. So if you have earthquakes, then you can have life, and they go together. If you take away the earthquakes, you take away the possibility of life. And I mean, we have Professor John Bryant here. He's a geneticist, looks at genetics, and he will tell you that the same mutations that cause cancer are similar to the mutations that allow us to be different from one another, that allow evolution to go forward. So if you want evolution, you have to risk cancer. There's no way around it. So a lot of things in life is this coordinated. Did I say that appropriately? Is that okay? Yeah. That's always good. So if we're saying that for whether it's a package deal or God needs to allow us to be independent creatures, or whether it has to do with free will or free process, God doesn't stop natural evil from happening. So we might ask a different question. How does God respond to this suffering caused by natural disasters? Okay, take 2 minutes, talk about how God might respond. Okay, so let's come together. We're in the final moments here of our time. So I heard a great answer at the back. Right at the back. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah. What did you say? How does God respond to the suffering they cause? All right, doesn't respond. Okay. Yeah, you could say that if you're talking about God responding in compassionate ways.
Yeah.
What might be some possibilities? Middle table? What were you discussing?
We were talking about how in the story of Job, like, he's suffering, but he still remains faithful to God.
Okay.
Because of it, God gives back, like, his crops and his land and gives him more children and stuff. So I guess
We could call that maybe a redemption.
yeah.
Does that work? So a redemption of the suffering? Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a lot of suffering, God could be at work giving back what has been lost, and then you think, well, what if the person dies? What possibilities are there then? Go to heaven. What about the non-human creatures?
They come to heaven with us.
They come to heaven with us. Yeah. So there are ways to talk about a new life for suffering creatures. What else might God be doing? Do we have any thoughts? How do people respond to this suffering?
Curse him.
Sorry?
Curse God.
Well, they can curse God. Yeah.
They get involved.
They get involved.
Give people a chance to help others, to help those in need.
Right. So God could be inspiring other people to respond so that other people become the modes of divine action in the world in response to that. One other idea that's in the literature is that God suffers with those who suffer. Does that help at all? We say God co-suffers.
How does he go so far?
Well, in the way that if you have a friend in the hospital ward and you go in and you sit with them, you're in a sense suffering with them,
Yeah.
right? Does that help at all?
Yes.
Yeah, but you can see like the person suffering, like the person co-suffering, like you can see them feeling pain with you, but like you don't see God feeling pain with you. He's not even supposed to be hurt. He's supposed to be a perfect being. Like, why would he suffer? Like,
Yeah, it's a really good point. And one of the things, again, I said we're all speaking from a perspective. From a Christian perspective, people would say that they have seen God suffer. And that's what the whole Jesus thing was about, right? And so Christians have this really weird thing where I don't actually, but they wear a cross around their neck, which is an instrument of torture. You know, it would be like walking around with a little electric chair or a, injection needle. But Christians will walk around with a crucifix, saying that this is where we see God suffering with us. A different sort of thing is that you just talked about God being this perfect being removed from the world, right? If God co-suffers, here's a way it might help. Do you guys know this guy? Right? Stands above them. He's going to send these knights out to go rescue Princess Fiona. And he says, "Some of you may die, but that is a risk I am willing to take." Right? So if you have a view where God doesn't suffer, God is this perfect being way out there, then you have a Lord Farquaad. But if you have a God who is deeply engaged and co-suffers, it may not prevent the suffering of the other, but it does seem to make a theological difference. So I'm going to stop there because we are unfortunately out of time, but I'm so grateful for your attention and your ability here. Thank you.